It's great to welcome back to the program today Thom Hartmann, of course, host of the Thom Hartmann program and author of the Hidden History series. The latest edition of this book, the latest in the series, is The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. You know, Thom, as I was preparing for the interview, I recently read Jared Diamond's book about traditional societies, the world until yesterday, and I couldn't help relate the two books, you talking about the history of American democracy and what works best in terms of how we organize government and society to produce ideally peace, ideally happiness, prosperity, etc. And couldn't help but think of the similarities in terms of some of the things that Diamond discusses in his book about the pros and cons of modern democracies versus more traditional societies like he studied in New Guinea, et cetera. Maybe we'll get to some of those overlaps, but maybe just to start, you argue that elements of how the United States is organized today, important elements, are actually the best way to organize societies. Can you talk a little bit about your research, your process, and the alternatives and why they are not so good?
Yeah, well, it's not just humanity, it turns out. And this was one of the more fascinating findings. Back a little more than a decade ago, Conrad and Roper, two scientists in the UK, postulated that our understanding of decision making in animals is all wrong. That, we've got this superimposition of ancient European kingdoms on the animal kingdom. In fact, we call it a kingdom. With the assumption that alpha animals make all the decisions. And they suggested that, along the lines of Darwin's theory of natural selection, the alpha animal would have first choice of sexual partner to pass along the strongest genes, but that would be it. And the decision making would be made democratically by majority rule, essentially. And they published this in Nature, and James Randerson and a few other scientists decided to test it. They started out with a herd of red deer in the forest near at the university, Essex University, and found that, sure enough, the deer made decisions democratically. When they had to decide what time and when and which watering hole to go to, they would start pointing their body toward one particular watering hole. And when they hit a 51% threshold, the whole herd would just assemble itself and go to that watering hole. When they put a predator, or what the deer thought might be a predator, it was a stuffed wolf near one of the watering holes, it actually lifted the threshold from 51% to 66%. Which is, by the way, something we built into the Constitution for really serious stuff like amending the Constitution itself. So I called Ken Conrad and I said, what happened when you published this? And he said, we heard from all these different disciplines. The bug guy said that, a ball of gnats in the summertime, in the air, and they'll be just kind of hanging out there, and then the whole ball of gnats will move, 2 feet to the left. He said, what's going on? You do the slow motion photography and you find that they're all voting with each wing beat. And when 51% of the gnats move their bodies 3 degrees to the right, the whole ball of gnats moves 3 degrees to the right. A fish guy said we see the same thing with schooling behavior in fish. A bird guy, this is how bird flocks decide. Literally every wing beat is a vote, and the votes are constantly being measured, monitored, and counted by everybody in the flock. So it turns out that democracy is the default state of humanity. If that's the case, then you would expect that in societies that have spent thousands, tens of thousands of years fine-tuning and experimenting with how to live successful,y that you would find a lot of democracy. And in fact, that's true. Not all Aboriginal and Indigenous societies around the world are organized in a democratic fashion, but the majority are. And you go back to Peter Farb's book in 1968, Man's Rise to Civilization, his recounting first contact with 34 different Native American tribes in the 1600s. The majority of them were democratic. You look at how the Iroquois Confederacy influenced our experience, and Ben Franklin's famous statement that if 5 nations of ignorant savages have been able to forge a bond that has lasted in peace for 1,000 years, it should be a surprise if 13 states of educated Englishmen can't do the same. Democracy, it turns out, is our default mode, and as humans, and there's always going to be people rising up and trying to violate that, typically out of greed or out of fear, and accumulate great wealth. But that's how it works. In fact, there was a piece in Nature just last week um, about some archaeologists working in Central America, where they're finding all these ancient cities buried under the jungle and whatnot. Now that they're using X-ray mapping from the air, and as they excavate them, they're discovering repeatedly no evidence of great wealth, no evidence of great poverty, and no evidence of a ruling class. That these were apparently democratically run societies. And the point that they made in this Nature article was that when you compare the democratic societies from small towns to fairly large communities of hundreds of thousands in Mesoamerica to their neighbors that were run dictatorially, the democratic societies were the most resilient. They were the most likely to survive for a long period of time through things like famine, extreme weather, and even invasion by other tribes. So, I haven't read that book by Diamond. I've read two of his previous books, but so I can't speak to it. But that's what I know about democracy and why the democratic experiment in America has lasted as long as it has.
So if we think about democracy in two categories, direct and representative, one of the really interesting things is that if you read sociology, anthropology, psychology, there seems to be this convergence of the idea that at a human level, once you get beyond groups of about 150 people, representative democracy of some kind, specialization and delegation, some kind of central organizing structure, representatives of sorts are ideal all the way to necessary, depending on what you're reading. The idea that it becomes practically difficult to employ direct democracy and involve everyone in every decision after about 150 people. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe how there are some modern political ideologies, some versions of libertarianism, for example, that seem to run directly counter to what the sociology, anthropology, and psychology have to say about that idea?
Yeah, it was, I want to say Malcolm Dowell. That's not his last name, though. He popularized this back about 15, 20 years ago. Anyway.
Do you mean Malcolm Gladwell?
Yes.
Oh, okay, okay.
Thank you much. He popularized this notion that our brain structures we're physically, our brain is organized in such a way that we can basically manage up to 150 friends, acquaintances, neighbors, community members in our tribe. And then once you exceed that number, anonymity becomes possible. Below that number, anonymity is not possible. And with anonymity comes the ability to violate social norms with little consequence. And that's when you hit the point where you can't have, pure democracy. It's one of the arguments about why the Greek democracy failed. It was not a representative democracy. It was a direct democracy, more or less. I mean, it required 6,001 people to show up to vote on anything. And your showing up was a matter of being chosen by lottery, basically. It was like jury duty. And in fact, the people who didn't show up were referred to as the idiota, which is where our word idiot comes from. So, as the Greeks expanded this out of a single city state, it reached those limits that you're talking about, David. And it wasn't helped by Aristotle and by the revolution of the 300 and then the revolution of the 30, which was basically rich people saying, okay, enough already with this experiment. We want to be in charge. And that's one of the reasons why I think the founders thought that representative democracy was going to be the way to go. So yeah, absolutely, excellent point.
In the book, you, to some degree, I would say, pretty effectively dispel the idea of the U.S. as a supposedly Christian nation. And over the last 5, 7, 8, 10 years, we've seen more brazen and not even really veiled statements from people like your Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert types, where rather than saying it subtly or with coded language, being much more upfront about their belief that actually Christianity should directly bear on civil government and law, etc. And you usually get folks who, they'll get a talking point or two from some think tank and they'll say all of the founding fathers were deists and their intention was ABC, and they'll pull some letter and point to one line or something along these lines and say, all of you people talking about separation of church and state are simply wrong. The founding fathers did want the U.S. to be a Christian nation. Of course, you view that as incorrect and you dispel that myth in the book. What is the best for my audience who may be confronted with people at Thanksgiving who put forward such a belief or whatever the case may be? What is the best empirical case to shut down that argument that we're increasingly hearing from some?
Well, an easy one is the treaty that George Washington negotiated with the Barbary. They were referred to as pirates, but the Barbary states. It's called the Treaty of Tripoli, that was ultimately signed by John Adams and ratified by a majority of members of the United States Senate in 1790, whatever the year was, I forget. And that treaty says explicitly, Article 11 of the treaty says, as America was in no way founded based on the Christian religion. I mean, that's verbatim. That's literally the words. Therefore, there should be no enmity between the United States and Mohammedan nations, Muslim nations. That was the consensus. There were some fanatical Christians at the founding of the Republic. Probably the most famous is Patrick Henry, Mr. Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death. He was the richest man in Virginia, or one of them. He was the largest slaveholder in Virginia. He held over 360 humans in bondage, and one of the cruelest slave masters, apparently. And he was a fanatical born-again Christian who used his Christianity to justify his slavery, his enslavement of people. He also opposed the Constitution. It was his opposition to the Constitution at the Virginia Ratifying Convention that caused James Madison to modify the Second Amendment from for the security of a free nation to for the security of a free state, to satisfy Patrick Henry's fear that a president might use Article 1, Section 8 to mobilize the Virginia National Guard and move it out of state, because the Virginia National Guard was also the Virginia Slave Patrol, and he saw, his own slaves rising up against him if that happened. But setting aside Patrick Henry, George Washington was a deist. He referenced Christianity in a couple of speeches, but barely. Thomas Jefferson was a deist and openly spoke against Christianity. His Bible, the Jefferson Bible, is still in print. He took basically a razor blade to the four Gospels and cut out all of Jesus's miracles. He presents Jesus as a philosopher, basically. There were some Christians among the founders, enthusiastic Christians. James Madison, Jefferson's protege, was a church-going Christian, and his big fear was that, and he and Jefferson had a 20-year running debate about this. Jefferson was afraid that if a priest, his word, it was a kind of a generic term back then for minister or pastor, was that if a priest ever became president, it would be the end of the Republic. Madison wasn't so worried about that. He was worried about what would happen if the government tried to regulate religion or even tried to help religion. In fact, in 1809, when Madison became president, his first veto was to veto legislation. George Washington had set up a poorhouse in Washington, D.C. that was paid for with federal money to house, clothe, provide medical care, and feed indigent people. And there was a minor religious revival in America in the early 1800s. And so in 1809, Congress renewed the funding for George Washington's poorhouse, his first attempt at American socialism. But they mandated that the money be routed through a church in D.C. And Madison vetoed that, saying that this would be destructive. It would not only be contradictory to the principles of the Constitution, but it would be destructive to the church. that churches should not take money from the government. It's a corrupting and corrosive thing. And, so it turns out that both he and Jefferson were right. So John Adams, another one, John Adams in his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson later in life, and I reprint some of it in the book. John Adams was a fervent Christian. He would sometimes go to 3 different church services on a Sunday. He took notes, that survived his death, notes from all of the sermons that he heard. I mean, he was really into it. And he was equally emphatic that our government was not Christian. It was not based in Christianity. It should not be based in Christianity. If you look at the 10 Commandments, there's only 2 of them that have any parallel in law. Don't murder and don't steal. There's no law that says that you have to be stoned to death if you speak back to your parents, although it says that in Deuteronomy. There's no law that says that you have to be stoned to death if you worship a god other than the 3rd century Bronze Age sky god, of the Hebrews. It's just this idea that America is a Christian nation. It's had 2 major revivals, well, really arguably 3 major revivals, one in the 1830s, one in the 1950s, which is when, in 54 and 56 was when In God We Trust went on our currency, and One Nation Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. But that kind of faded out with the 60s. And now we've got another one of these revivals going on. Both the one in the 50s and the one today are being driven largely by people who claim to be, pastors of God, who are really seeking political power and wealth. And many of them are getting a lot of both. Pat Robertson died a billionaire last month.
Yeah, that is something we discussed extensively at the time. The book is The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. We've been speaking with the book's author, Thom Hartmann. You can also learn more about Thom's program at thomhartmann.com. Thom, always great having you on. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for inviting me, David. It's always great talking with you.